She knelt in the dark, damp earth, the hem of her canvas skirt stained with mud. The sun was not yet a threat, just a pale suggestion of light in the east, but she was already at her work. Her fingers, chapped and strong, pressed the tiny, sharp seeds into the soil along the high shoulder of the ditch. One by one. A patient, methodical rhythm. Down the long, straight line her late husband, William, had dug with a mule and plough 2 years before. A deep, wide trench meant to divert the spring melts and the sudden summer downpours away from their small clapboard house and the sturdy corral. It was a good ditch. Deep and true. But she knew it was not enough. She worked her way along the earthen bank, a small burlap sack of seeds beside her. The seeds were a mix of grasses she'd spent the better part of the last autumn gathering from the few untouched hollows and creek beds miles from her ranch. Big blue stem, with its turkeyfoot seed head. Indian grass, golden and feathery. Switchgrass, with its fine, airy panicles. To anyone watching, it would have looked like nothing. Like a woman planting weeds in a perfectly good trench. Her neighbor to the west, Mr. Henderson, had ridden by once last week, slowed his horse, and watched her for a long moment, his face a mask of polite confusion. He'd tipped his hat, but the question was plain in his eyes. He probably thought it was grief, making her do strange, pointless things. Making the place pretty, maybe. A woman's foolish notion of gardening in a place that broke plows and hearts with equal indifference. She did not correct him. She just nodded back and continued her work, pressing another seed into the cool, forgiving dirt. If you've ever lived in a place where the sky feels bigger than the land, where you can see the weather coming from 100 miles off, you might understand the quiet calculations that go on in a person's mind. It's a landscape that demands attention to the small things. If you find these kinds of stories about quiet work and hidden wisdom valuable, consider following along for more. Let us know in the comments about a time you saw someone's strange project turn out to be the smartest thing anyone could have done. Her ranch was a small square of deeded land in a vast, rolling sea of prairie. The house was modest, built of cottonwood timber William had hauled from the nearest river valley, 20 miles south. The corral was stout, the small barn weatherproof. It was all his work, his legacy. And now, it was hers to keep or to lose. When the fever took him that winter, it had felt like the world had been hollowed out, leaving only the wind and the silence. The silence was the hardest part. In the first few months, she had found herself speaking to him, expecting an answer from the other room, only to be met with the creak of the floorboard settling. The ranch was all she had left of him, a physical testament to his sweat and his dreams. Losing it would be like losing him all over again. Her father, Thomas, had ridden out from the distant settlement after the funeral, his face etched with a practical sorrow. He was a man who understood fences, herds, and ledgers. He did not understand a 25-year-old woman, widowed and alone, trying to run a ranch by herself. "You should sell, Amelia," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Come back to town. It's no life for you out here. This land requires a man's strength." He saw the ditch, the house, the barn. He saw a project too large, a burden too heavy. He did not see the things she saw. He did not see the way the water moved. The inciting incident had not been a catastrophe. It was a warning. A whisper. It happened the spring after William died. A late, heavy snowpack in the low hills to the north had melted all at once under a week of unseasonably warm sun. The runoff came not as a trickle, but as a surge. The ditch had done its job, mostly. It had caught the main flow and shunted it eastward, away from the house. But she had stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders against a wind that still carried a winter chill, and watched the water. It was a churning, brown torrent, thick with mud and debris. It moved with a frightening speed. And as it raced down the length of the ditch, it chewed at the bare earth banks. It licked and pulled, scouring the soil, undercutting the edges. She watched, mesmerized and terrified, as a section of the bank near the corral, no bigger than a wagon wheel, simply collapsed. It dissolved into the current, gone in an instant. The water swirled into the new void, clawing for more. The main corral post on that corner, the one William had sunk 6 feet deep, was now just a few feet from the crumbling edge. Another few hours of this, and the corral would be breached, the earth beneath it washed away. The flow had crested and begun to recede before any real damage was done. By the next morning, the ditch was merely a muddy channel again. But the scar was there. The collapsed bank, the exposed roots of the prairie scrub further down. A warning. The ditch was a vessel, but it was a weak one. It could channel the water, but it could not withstand its power. It fought the water, tried to contain it through brute force and sharp angles. And the water, patient and relentless, would always win that fight. It would tear the land apart in the process. She'd made a note in the small leather-bound journal she kept. The ditch is a wound. Water moves too fast. Scours the soil. Needs reinforcement. It was a problem she did not know how to solve. She didn't seek advice from her father or from Mr. Henderson. They would have told her to shore it up with rock, if she could find any, or to dig it deeper, wider. More brute force. More straight lines. Instead, she rode out to see Grandmother Rose, William's grandmother, who lived in a tiny sod house a day's ride away, a relic from an older time. Rose was nearly 80, her face a beautiful, intricate map of her life, her eyes still sharp and clear. She had lived on this land since she was a girl, long before the neat, square plots and the deep-cutting plows. Amelia explained what she had seen. The fast water. The collapsing bank. Rose listened, her hands busy mending a piece of canvas. She didn't offer a solution right away. Instead, she talked about the past. This land had veins, she said, her voice a dry rustle. Before the herds came and packed the earth down hard. Before the plows. The water didn't run off it like a slate roof. It walked. It crept. It soaked in. She paused, looking out the small window toward the endless grass. The old creeks, they weren't deep ditches like your William dug. They were wide, and shallow, and choked with grass. Tall grass. So thick a man could get lost in it. The water had to fight its way through that grass. It had to slow down. And when it slowed, it dropped its mud. It fed the land it passed over. It didn't steal it. Amelia listened, absorbing every word. What kind of grass? She asked. Oh, all kinds. The ones with roots like iron wire, that held the soil together in a web. The ones that grew tall and dense, like a brush. The water couldn't just push them over. It had to weave through them. A sieve. That's what it was. A great, long sieve. That was the answer. It wasn't about fighting the water. It was about persuading it. It was about giving it something to do, a job to perform. Slow down. Drop your burden of soil. Let go. She didn't need to build a wall against the flood. She needed to build a filter. A break. A long, living sieve made of grass and roots. The image was so clear in her mind. The work would be immense, but the logic of it felt as solid and true as bedrock. The work began with searching. She spent weeks that summer riding in ever-widening circles from the ranch, her journal tucked into her saddlebag. She wasn't looking for good grazing land, the way her neighbors did. She was looking for the opposite. She was looking for the forgotten places, the steep-sided gullies and rocky outcrops where the plows couldn't reach and the cattle hadn't trampled everything into dust. In these small, protected pockets, the old world still lived. She found them. Patches of big blue stem, taller than her head, its purplish stems swaying in the wind. Stands of Indian grass, their bronze plumes catching the afternoon light. And in the lower, wetter spots, dense clumps of switchgrass. She would dismount, take out her journal, and draw the plants with careful, shaded lines. She noted the soil they grew in, the way their roots clung to the earth, the density of their stalks. She was learning the language of the land, a grammar of stems and seeds and roots. Harvesting was slow, painstaking labor. She would wait until the seed heads were dry and ripe, then carefully strip them by hand into her burlap sack. Hours of work for a few handfuls of seed. The wind was her constant enemy, threatening to scatter the precious harvest before she could gather it. Her neighbors saw her out in what they considered wasteland, picking weeds. They likely added it to the growing list of Amelia's strange, grief-addled behaviors. She didn't care. She was assembling the tools for her solution, one tiny seed at a time. By the first frost, she had 3 large sacks full, a treasure of genetic resilience. The planting began the following spring, as soon as the ground was soft enough to work. This was the part that tested her body as much as the gathering had tested her patience. Day after day, she was on her knees, crawling along the berm of the ditch. The first attempt was a failure. She scattered the seeds carefully, but a single hard rain came a week later and washed most of them into the bottom of the ditch, a useless muddy paste. She almost despaired. She sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange, and felt the weight of the task. It was too much. Her father was right. But then she thought of Grandmother Rose's words. The roots hold the soil in a web. Her seeds had no roots. They had no anchor. She needed to give them one. The next day, she began again, but with a new method she'd read about in a tattered almanac. She mixed the seeds with clay she dug from a small deposit near the creek and a little water, rolling the mixture into small, marble-sized balls. It was messy, tedious work. Her hands were caked in mud from dawn till dusk. But each ball was a tiny promise, a package of potential with its own small anchor of weight and substance. She pressed these seed balls into the earth along the ditch banks, spacing them carefully. Thousands of them. It took her a month to line the entire length of the ditch, on both sides. And then she waited. She watched the banks for any sign of green. The first shoots were so small, so fragile, they were almost invisible. She protected them from the harsh sun with makeshift shades of canvas. She hauled water for them when the days were too dry. She was no longer just a rancher, she was a gardener, tending the most unusual garden in the territory. Slowly, painstakingly, the green lines began to thicken. By midsummer, the banks of the ditch were covered in a fine, green fuzz. By autumn, the grasses were knee-high, a strange, shaggy mane on the landscape's sharp, geometric haircut. They were alive. They were taking root. It was during that second summer that Mr. Henderson made his comment. He reined in his horse at her fence line, looking from her to the ditch and back again. The grasses were now waist-high in places, thick and green, bending and whispering in the constant prairie wind. They looked utterly out of place next to the heavily grazed, shorter grasses of the surrounding pasture. "Making the place pretty, Amelia?" he asked. The question was friendly enough on the surface, but the tone was laced with a kind of gentle condescension. It was the same tone men used when a woman embroidered a pillowcase or chose a new pattern for a quilt. A pleasant, but ultimately useless, domestic art. She looked at the vibrant, living walls of her ditch, the product of 2 years of back-breaking, solitary work. She thought of the intricate web of roots knitting the soil together beneath the surface, a hidden strength no one else could see. She thought of the way the dense stalks would slow the water, making it drop its silt, feeding the very banks it sought to destroy. Pretty was the last word she would have used. "Something like that, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice even. "Just trying to keep things in their place." He chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "Well, it's certainly different." He tipped his hat again and rode on, shaking his head slightly. He saw decoration. She saw engineering. The conversation, short as it was, marked a turning point. Her work was visible now. And it was profoundly misunderstood. Let them think what they wanted. The real test hadn't come yet. The test arrived the following spring. It came on a wind from the north, a vast, bruised-looking mass of clouds that swallowed the horizon. For 3 days, it rained. Not a gentle, soaking rain, but a relentless, driving deluge. The sky was a sheet of grey, the world reduced to the sound of water drumming on the roof and the gurgle of the gutters overflowing. The ground became a sodden sponge, then a slick of mud. Puddles linked up to become ponds, and ponds began to move. On the fourth day, the rain slackened to a drizzle, but the real threat began. The runoff from the hills. She heard it before she saw it, a low, distant roar that grew steadily louder. She went to the window and saw the ditch. It was already running full, but this was different. A crest was coming. A wall of brown water, churning with uprooted brush and debris, was moving down the man-made channel. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. 2 years of work, of gathering and planting and tending, were about to be put on trial. The water hit the first section of her planted grasses not with a crash, but with a deep, muffled hiss. The wall of water, which should have scoured the bank, was forced to press its way through the dense stand of switchgrass and blue stem. The speed of the torrent visibly slackened as it entered the grassy section. The tall, flexible stalks bent under the force, laying almost flat, but their combined strength was immense. They didn't break. They became a thick, pliable mat that dissipated the water's energy. She watched, transfixed, for hours. The water level rose until it was nearly cresting the berm, but the banks were holding. The churning, destructive current in the center of the ditch was buffered from the soil by the thick cushion of grass. The water that filtered through the stalks was slower, gentler. She could see the effect clearly. The water entering the grassy section was a thick, opaque brown, the color of coffee with a little milk. The water that flowed out the other end was still muddy, but noticeably lighter, clearer. Her living sieve was working. It was straining the flood, capturing the precious topsoil and forcing it to settle along the banks, reinforcing them even as the flood tried to tear them down. The roar of the water was a constant presence for 2 full days. She barely slept, listening to the storm, watching the ditch. She thought of William, who had dug the trench with such pride. He had seen the problem of the water, but he had solved it with the logic of a plough, a sharp, deep cut. She was solving it with the logic of the prairie itself, a soft, deep, and resilient web. When the sun finally broke through on the 6th day, the world was remade. The water in the ditch had receded to a gentle, muddy flow. Amelia pulled on her boots and walked outside. The air smelled of wet earth and clean, washed air. Her grasses were flattened, plastered with mud and silt, but they were whole. The roots had held. The banks of her ditch were not only intact, they were actually built up in places, covered in a new, rich layer of deposited soil. Her house, her barn, her corral, all stood on an island of damp, but undamaged, ground. Then she looked west, toward Mr. Henderson's property. The sight made her draw a sharp breath. His land was a ruin. The water, having nowhere to slow down, had ripped and torn its way across his pastures. A 50-foot section of his handsome wooden fence was simply gone, the post snapped off or ripped out entirely. His lower field was a shallow lake of muddy water, the spring planting drowned and buried. A hay wagon was overturned, half submerged in a newly carved gully. The flood had not been persuaded or slowed on his property, it had raged, and it had taken whatever it wanted. The contrast was absolute. Stark. Her quiet, misunderstood work had held fast while his conventional, sensible fences had been swept away like toys. Later that day, she saw a rider approaching. It was her father. His face was grim, his clothes spattered with mud. He had clearly ridden through the devastation that stretched for miles across the territory. He rode up to her fence line, his eyes taking in the scene, her intact ranch, and beyond it, the wreckage of her neighbors. He dismounted slowly, his gaze fixed on the ditch. He walked over to the bank, the mud sucking at his boots. He reached down and touched the flattened, silt-covered stems of the blue stem. He followed the line of the ditch with his eyes, seeing how it had channeled and, more importantly, tamed the floodwater. He stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the squelch of his boots and the cry of a lone hawk circling overhead. He turned back to her, his expression unreadable at first. Then, a slow, deep understanding dawned in his eyes. He had seen the proof. It held, he said. His voice was quiet, filled with a note of awe she had never heard from him before. He looked from the grass to her, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at his widowed daughter in need of rescue. He was looking at a peer. William would be proud, Amelia. He would be proud. That was all. But it was everything. In the weeks that followed, the story of Amelia's ditch spread. At first, it was just whispers. Then, people started to ride out to see for themselves. They saw the destruction on the surrounding ranches and the strange, green-bordered sanctuary of her land. Mr. Henderson came by, his hat in his hands, his earlier condescension replaced by a humbled curiosity. He didn't apologize, not in so many words, but his question was enough. "What is that grass?" he asked, his eyes on the ditch. "And where can a man get some of the seed?" She told him. She told them all. She explained what Grandmother Rose had told her, about how the land used to be, about working with the water instead of against it. She showed them the seed heads, explained the clay balls, described the patience it took. She was no longer the strange, grieving widow. She was the woman who understood the water. Her small act of private perseverance had become a lesson for the entire community, a new kind of wisdom taking root in the hard-won soil. The land, she had learned, had its own strength. The challenge was not to break it to your will, but to learn its language and borrow its power. As the naturalist Aldo Leopold once wrote, the land is one organism. Its parts, like our own parts, compete with each other and cooperate with each other. The competitions are as much a part of the inner workings as the cooperations. She hadn't planted grass for beauty. She had planted it to invite a deeper kind of cooperation, to mend a wound not just in the earth, but in the way people saw it. What does it take to see the hidden logic in the world around us, and what quiet, patient work is needed to bring it to life?